Getting Dennis out of the temple had, quite honestly, been the easy part. Carrying him was just a matter of adjusting his gravity until he was lighter than a feather, making it less of carrying him and more of just pulling him after Sora while he floated. Normally, it was hard to use his blessing on people, but that was because humans got really stressed out when their gravity changed and tended to struggle and throw Sora's power off balance. It was a testament to Dennis's weakness that he didn't struggle at all. And then getting over the wall was easy. In the chaos and the dark, it was easy to walk up the side of a tree and then down on the other side of the wall without making a bit of noise. Now, the hard part was navigating a city that he had never been in before and finding a rebellion that he wasn't entirely certain still existed. Sora spent one night on the streets, hiding behind bags of trash and hoping that Dennis's soft moaning wouldn't either attract muggers or mean that he was dying. How did one find a rebellion that didn't want to be found, especially when he was wearing the bright crimson red of the religion they hated? Sora ended up stripping down to his brown tunic and shoving the crimson robes into a ditch. He dropped his bracer, too, sending a mental apology to Edo for discarding the important item. Not being recognized as his Arcanian acolyte was way more important right now. I just need to make sure he doesn't die. I need to make sure he doesn't die. Sora propped Dennis up in hiding and covered him with an old tarp. Dennis was barely conscious anymore, just mumbling softly in his sleep, eyes fluttering every now and then. The best place to get information was a bar, right? At least he could find a doctor. That was what he needed right now. Licking his lips nervously, Sora ducked in through the swinging doors. The bar was almost completely empty this early in the morning. There was only one person sitting in the far corner, a skinny shape draped in a hood and cowl so that Sora couldn't see their face. Then there was the barkeeper, a woman of average height with her dusty blonde hair in a bun and her spectacles sliding down her nose. She looked up when Sora wandered to the counter, and her eyes narrowed slightly at his tunic. It was still the style and color of his Arcanian servant, which wouldn't be looked at kindly, but it wasn't like he had the time or ability to change. "We don't serve underage," she said, looking him up and down. "I'm not here for alcohol," Sora said. I need to know where I can find a doctor. I have a friend. He's really hurt. I need someone who can take care of him." The woman blinked, eyes fixing on Sora's for a moment. Sora bated his breath. This could be the moment of truth here. If someone thought he was lying, he could get sold out to the priests. Rajay would find out where his tortured servant had gone, and both of them would be dragged back to who knew what fate. The door to the back room of the bar opened, and both he and the barkeep looked towards it. A tall woman with her red bangs rolled up over her forehead peered, her tunic hugging her body a little snugly. "Aki," the barkeep said. "Kid says he needs a doctor." The woman, Aki, blinked as her eyes fell on Sora. Her eyes narrowed too. "Don't they have doctors in the temple?" she said, her voice more than a little poisonous. "I can't go to the temple," Sora said. He stepped forward and her hand twitched the blade at her hip. He put both of his hands up. He didn't need a weapon to kill her, but he didn't want to have to defend himself. He swallowed, wondering if his hands were shaking or if he was imagining it. "Please." Aki looked him over. Her hand still rested on her pommel, as though ready to slice him through in a second. Aki's eyes flickered to the barkeep. The woman shrugged, and Aki looked at Sora again. "Show me," she said, hands sliding off her blade. "But if this is some kind of prank, I won't be laughing." Sora breathed out in a rush. A weight he hadn't known was on his shoulders vanished, and he felt light, though he had just adjusted his own gravity. "Hurry, please. He's doing badly." He scurried from the bar. Aki did not run, but her long strides were enough to keep up with him as he led her out of the bar and down into the web of alleys where he had hidden Dennis. If there was some kind of deity up there, it was feeling generous today. Dennis's hiding place hadn't been touched, and Sora jogged over to tug the canvas away. He heard Aki's sharp intake of breath. Dennis looked pretty awful, yeah. Even with his back against the wall, which had the most damage, his arms were covered with scores of cuts and small puncture wounds, and burn marks littered his torso where his shirt had been ripped. "Goddess, you weren't lying," she said. She hurried forward, dropping to one knee beside Dennis's limp body. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. Sora hovered nervously while she checked his pulse, lifted his chin a bit to check his breathing, and tried to get a look at his eyes. "What in the goddess's name happened?" she said. "Please, you have to help him. I'll explain. I need to... He has information that will help the rebellion." Aki's eyes flashed to Sora, and for a moment Sora actually stepped back. Then she blew out, once. "Help me carry him," she said. "Back to the pub." I can do it." Now that he was in the presence of someone that could actually take care of Dennis, he felt flustered and winded. He didn't even bother to worry about showing off his blessing to a stranger. He needed to make sure Dennis got there safely. Aki gasped softly again as Sora carefully got Dennis to float, manipulating his gravity just enough so that he was suspended. He pulled him under the arms. Aki, at least, didn't seem the type to ask unnecessary questions. Sora liked her already. She just stood up and led the way down the alley, back to the pub. She held the doors open for Sora, then took him back to the back room. "Hale, don't let anyone disturb me until I say so. I'm going to have to be doing field surgery." The barkeep nodded in response, and then Sora, Dennis, and Aki were in the back room, and Aki shut the door behind them. "Hold him there for a moment," she said. Sora waited while Aki strode into the room. It was pretty big, but very plain, with chipped wooden walls and creaky, warped floors. A slightly raised dais like a stage sat at the far end, and the only other item of note was a table, which was currently covered in what looked like scrolls and maps and things. Aki had no time for ceremony. She swept all the papers off the table in a giant swoop. She grabbed at a canvas folded on the floor and flapped it out, turning it over and flinging it over the table. Then she beckoned for Sora, and Sora pulled Dennis through the air to the table. "Lay him on his stomach. Carefully, carefully. His back looks like it needs the most attention first." "Fucking hell, who did this to him?" "Roger," Sora said. Aki's eyes flashed at Sora, her mouth briefly parting with shock. But she got right back to the task at hand and helped Sora situate Dennis on his stomach, turning his head gently and tucking a small roll of canvas under his temple. Sora released his altered gravity slowly until he laid on the table. "Make yourself useful. Get all this crap on the floor out of the way." Sora normally didn't like being told what to do, but this was an emergency. He dropped down to the floor to gather up all the maps and scrolls. Some of them looked kinda ominous, actually, like a drawing of the temple with red marks along some of the walls, and he caught a few scribbles about the arrival and departure of certain important food deliveries from outlying territories. Oh, demons, he thought. Did I actually stumble on the rebellion? Is there a god out there after all? No time to think about that. He gathered everything up and laid them down in a corner away from the table so Aki wouldn't trip on anything. When he stood back up, dusting off his arms, Aki was already getting to work. "Come over here," she said, and Sora jolted to attention, scurrying back to the table. "Hold the light." She gave him a small oil lamp, and he held it up over Dennis to help her see what she was doing. She had a huge bag on the floor beside her, face tight as she examined his wounds. "He's been poisoned," she said. Sora's heart leaped. "You mean he's dying?" "No, I don't think it's fatal. Check his lips for me." Sora ducked down and looked at Dennis's lips. They're grayish, more than the rest of his skin. Any visible purple-colored veins around his lips? No. He'll live, but he's not going to enjoy it. Sora straightened back up, holding the oil lamp again. Aki was examining Dennis's arms, looking at some of the small puncture wounds, most of which were ringed with small, bluish circles. "Fodder root," she said, grimacing, "and a very high concentrate." "What's that?" Sora said. He probably shouldn't be asking questions, but he was trembling a bit and needed to talk to get rid of the uncharacteristic anxiety. "Hallucinogen. It enhances the senses, especially tactile." Sora felt his heart drop out. So Dennis was injected with something that enhanced his sense of touch, and then brutally tortured, making all of his pain double. Sora felt like he was going to throw up. "It'll have mostly passed through his system by now. Without another dose, he'll be fine. It's non-addictive." Sora thought maybe Aki was talking like this to keep him calm, and he felt a little miffed about it. He was going to be fine. Dennis was the one who was hurt, after all. Sora could handle this. He could handle a bit of blood. Aki grit her teeth at his horribly torn-up back next. I'm going to need water. She snatched the oil lamp from Sora's hands. Go to Hale and tell her I need a bucket of cold water and a clean rag. Hale was the barkeep, right? Sora didn't even nod. He just bolted back to the door and threw it. He stumbled against the door that blocked off the bar, making Hale's eyes flick up with a jump. Water, Sora said, his voice choked. We need a bucket of water and a clean rag. Hale reached silently under Sora's vision and lifted up a bucket with a rag already thrown over the side. She passed it to Sora over the counter. She must have been used to Aki needing it, being so prepared. Sora mumbled out a thank you and pushed back through the door. Aki snatched the bucket and gave Sora the oil lamp back. She dunked the rag into the water, making it splash over the sides, then pressed it at Dennis's back gently. Dennis's eyes flashed open and he hissed, his fingers digging into the canvas. Shh, 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 Aki murmured soothingly. You're okay. You're fine. You're safe. I'm here to take care of you. Her voice was immensely calming, even though Sora still felt like he was choking. Dennis's eyes, though, were wild, and for a moment he tried to force himself upwards. He immediately screamed, and his arms gave out. Aki kept murmuring, It's okay. You're safe. No one is hurting you. My name is Aki Izuyoi. I'm a doctor. I'm just cleaning your wounds. I'm going to help you. Dennis didn't seem to be able to speak. His mouth opened and closed, eyes full of tears. A whispery voice came out of his throat, so quiet that Sora couldn't hear right away. He tried again. I don't know, he whispered. I don't know where he went. I'm sorry, I don't know. Shh, it's okay, Aki said. My name is Aki Izuyoi, and I'm a doctor. I'm just cleaning your wounds. No one else is going to hurt you. You don't have to tell me anything. She's telling you the truth. It's okay. You're safe, Sora said. I took you out of the temple. You're not in the temple anymore. Dennis's eyes flickered towards Sora, but he didn't seem to be in the right angle to see him. He let out a soft, broken whine, eyes closing again. You're safe, Sora said again. You're safe, Dennis. Aki's shoulders jolted. She looked up at Sora, pausing briefly with her shock. Did you say, she started. Then she shook her head, muttering something about not now, and went back to work. It took what felt like hours, but Aki finished cleaning Dennis's wounds. A few of the cuts were so bad she had to sew them up, numbing the area first with the soft prick of a needle. Dennis screamed at that, flailing as though he were being given another dose of the hallucinogen. But Aki and Sora were able to talk him back down into quiet, and Aki finished working on him. She had Sora use his blessing to help him sit up so she could attend to his torso wounds without making him lay on his back. Finally, after what felt like centuries of work, Dennis was sleeping soundly, stitched and bandaged up, and laying peacefully on his stomach. Aki looked up again, her face sweaty, strands of hair stuck to her cheeks. Sora's hands were trembling around the oil lamp. His arms hurt from holding it up for so long, and it was honestly a wonder that he hadn't just dropped it. It took Aki pulling the lamp gently from Sora's fingers for him to finally let go of it and let his hands drop to the side, feeling every part of him trembling. I would offer you a chair if there were any, Aki said. She herself let out a huge sigh as she let herself collapse onto the raised dais as a makeshift seat. Sit down. You need to rest too. Sora's legs felt like lead, but he walked around the table and collapsed onto the dais beside her. He just stared at his knees for a while. His cheeks felt hot and his brain felt fried. That had been the most stressful few hours of his life. Aki pulled the canteen off of her hip and took a long swig. Sora had no sooner realized his own throat was parched before she pushed it against his chest. Drink. You worked hard today. Sora hesitated awkwardly before wrapping his fingers around the canteen. Whatever was in that canteen, it was way stronger than anything he was allowed to have at the temple, and he almost choked on it for a moment. He felt like there was smoke coming out of his ears after he finished his swig, but his throat didn't feel dry anymore. The hell was that? He said. She just smirked tiredly, accepting the canteen back and replacing it on her belt. When you watch enough people die on your table, you start needing something a little stronger. Sora pawed briefly at his tongue as though to rub the taste away. Now, what's your name, kid, and what are you doing hauling a servant out of the temple to find the rebellion? Sora ran his tongue over his lips before answering. My name is Sora, he said. Sora Shiunin. Aki raised an eyebrow at the name Shiunin. Of course she knew what it meant. It was a generic surname given to the staircase kids. You're an acolyte, not a servant then, she said, looking him up and down. What makes a boy like you want to betray your god? Or is this some elaborate trap? It's not a trap, Sora said. He actually felt offended. I don't believe in gods. Well, unfortunately, they seem to believe in us. I don't think the Emperor is real. Aki pursed her lips, waiting. It wasn't exactly the reaction he'd been expecting. And why was he explaining everything to her anyway? She fixed up Dennis without asking a single question or even asking for money, Sora thought. His gut was rarely wrong, and his gut said to trust her. Listen, he said. This is going to sound crazy, but there's like 2 different countries inside the temple. There's the outer priests who really believe in everything and are super zealous, and there's the inner priests who are all conniving political shitheads. He licked his lips again. He could go for another sip of whatever Aki was packing right about now. The inner priests are keeping secrets from us. Something's really wrong. Edo won't see it, but if he doesn't, he's going to die. Edo? Aki said. A brief pale washed over her face. You're talking about Phoenix, the high priest. Sora nodded. He didn't like the way Aki's face twisted up there, but he had to keep talking. Edo has no idea what Rajay's up to, he pushed on. I don't know what to say because you look like you want to kill something right now, but Edo's not a bad guy. He's just really, really misguided. He's one of the reasons my best friend is dead, she said dryly, along with quite a few others. Jack Atlas ring any bells, kid? Sora's stomach dropped. He had been right. Somehow he'd stumbled over the rebellion itself. Talk about coincidence. Maybe there was a god. He swallowed, fumbling for his words for a moment. He doesn't know, he said lamely. He doesn't know. What, that his religion is fucked up and he's destroying a lot of innocent lives? He doesn't know that he's being used. Aki stopped in the middle of her rant. Her eyes slid slowly to meet Sora's. For a moment, her face was completely neutral. Then she sighed, closing her eyes. Talk, she said. Keep it concise. What do you want? Sora's heart thrummed in his chest. If Edo knew that he was just being used by the inner priests to keep their power, if he knew that the Emperor was being tortured for their own political gain, he would turn on them. He licked his lips again. You want to take down Zarkania? How about a civil war between the priests themselves? Aki's lips parted into a small O. She stared at Sora in a new light, and Sora made sure to hold her gaze as long as possible. Then she huffed. So, she said, you want to tell Phoenix the truth, that he's a pawn and that his religion is fake. What happens then? Sora opened his mouth. He stopped. If Edo finds out it's all fake? He thought about the way Edo's voice lifted with awe when he preached, when he talked about the Emperor, the reverence shining in his eyes when the Emperor passed and he bowed to him, that light-hearted, calm smile of absolute faith. Sora might take that all away from him. Would he even be the same Edo? He closed his eyes and shook his head. No. Better disillusioned than dead. And Edo truly believed the Emperor was a god. If he found out that Rajay and the others were torturing him, using the Emperor, faking the Emperor's decrees and using them as their own political pawn, he'll turn on them, Sora affirmed again, looking up at Aki. He will. Did you ever think that he might already know and he's putting on an act? Sora snorted. Edo doesn't know how to act, he said. Besides, I spied on him enough. He's clueless. If he ever learned the truth, if he had a reason to go after Rajay, he would. And a lot of the priests like him. They'd rally around him if he asked. Rajay's scared of him because of that. Aki pressed her lips together and narrowed her eyes at Sora for a long, long moment. Then a half smile broke her face. I like you, she said. You're pretty devious. Sora huffed. Is that what you say to someone that brings you important information? Aki just laughed slightly. She stood up, her knees cracking. Actually, we already knew that the Emperor was a pawn, she said. Sora's stomach dropped. You did? Yeah. Aki's head tilted towards Sora. He passed through here not too long ago, after all. In fact, I had a feeling I knew what you were doing here already. Dennis is the name the Emperor gave us, of the one who set off the firebomb to help him escape. Sora just stared at her, his mouth hanging open. What? Then his heart quickened. The Emperor did escape on his own, then. He had found his way here, and where was he now? Sora almost asked. He decided against it. The less he knew about the Emperor, the better. Dennis had known that, Sora thought with a shudder. He stood up too. Dennis is my proof for Edo, he said. So... I don't want to let you out of my sight yet, said Aki, talking over him. No offense, kid. But you know where we are now, and I can tell by the look in your eyes that you figured out I'm one of the rebellion's leaders. One of the leaders? No, Sora wasn't that much of a mind reader to figure that out, but he had figured out the rebellion bit. He kept his mouth shut, though. I want to trust you, because I like you and you seem like a good kid, Aki said. But I have to be cautious. You stay here with us. But I have to get to Edo. I have to tell him. Without Dennis being in good condition, he can't tell Edo anything. Besides, can you be sure he'll believe the word of a servant? Sora ground his teeth. She had a point. What could he... He dug in his pocket, pulling out the slightly crumbled pieces of paper he had taken from below ground. He had made sure to take them out of his robe pockets before discarding the robes. I found these underground, he said. Let me send them to Edo. Aki frowned. She plucked the papers from his hands and looked them over. Notes for what kind of runes to put on the Emperor? And medical notes on... She frowned, her face going slightly ashen. Clearly, she understood more of the shorthand than Sora had. If I tell him I found these underground and that he needs to look, that might at least pique his curiosity, and he'll find out on his own, Sora said. That should get the ball rolling, and I can still stay where you can see me. Aki looked hesitant. Sora knew this was a gamble. She could think that he was lying, that these papers were some kind of code, but he had just pulled them out of his pocket. He couldn't have written them up while helping with Dennis or anything. Finally, Aki nodded. Write a short note on the back, she said. I'll be reading it to make sure it's not dangerous for us. Then I'll send a falcon. Sora's chest rushed with relief. Thank you, he breathed. She found a quill and an inkwell in her bag, and Sora dropped down to the ground to scribble something out. He signed off with a small sigil, his own personal manufacture. Edo would know it came from him. He swallowed as Aki took the papers and walked towards the door to get the falcon. He hoped this was enough. Edo didn't get falcons, not directly to him anyway. Messages were left either with Sora or one of his other attendants and delivered to him when possible. He was too busy to wait for a falcon to drop something off. Then again, Sora had been MIA again, so he wasn't collecting Edo's mail. Where was that boy? It wasn't unusual behavior, but considering his recent conversation with him, Edo was getting a little worried about where he might be. Rajay would use any excuse to take a stab at him, so Sora snooping in places he shouldn't could be disastrous, especially right now. Rajay was already using the Emperor's disappearance to sow uncertainty towards Edo's leadership. It was, of course, Edo's and the Outer Priest's duty to run security on festivals. Damn that man and his damn politics. But either way, what was a falcon doing in his window? Edo blinked as he approached, considering the bird from a distance first. It wasn't one of the temple birds. It was more ruffled, with a mismatched color scheme that indicated mixed breeding, rather than the sleek, elegant birds of the temple aviary. But there was a thick message tied to its ankle, and it was waiting patiently for him, so it was a well-trained bird. He reached for the message, and it automatically lifted its leg for him to untie it. As soon as he was done, the falcon flapped its wings, making Edo jump, and took off, disappearing off into the sky. Edo briefly glanced out the window, trying to see where it went, but it was already gone. He frowned as he turned from the window to unscroll the message. His heart seized and his blood ran cold. This was Roget's handwriting. And was that? A drawing of the Emperor, only his torso was bare, and these were sketches for runes. Blood runes. Highly experimental ones. They were... Sweet demon lord, these were mind control runes. Experimental and completely illegal for how dangerous they were to psychology and physiology. Addo's mouth felt dry. Roget's up to something, Sora had said. Up to this? Roget was doing this to the Emperor? No, this had to become some kind of fake. Something to make him confused and fracture the clergy. It was certainly a passable forgery, though. He ruffled to the second sheaf, and if his blood had been ice before, it was nothing compared to now. This shorthand. No, impossible. Some of it was generic medical shorthand, but others were in a variant that only trained priests of the highest rank should know. Not just anyone could learn this. This was real? And what the shorthand was talking about. Effects of demon blood in human physiology. Hybrids, Edo said, his voice stumbling over the words. Was Roget experimenting with the Emperor's blood on other human beings? No, impossible. You couldn't just take the Emperor's blood. You couldn't even touch the Emperor. Edo was trembling so badly that the papers slipped from his fingers. They twisted and fluttered to the ground before he could catch them, landing with their backs facing up. There was a note on the back. That was Sora's handwriting. Sora's sigil. I found these in the chambers underground. That's where the secrets are kept. Please, you have to have a look for yourself. I can't come back yet, but I promise I'm doing what I can. Sora. Edo had to press a hand to his mouth to stop the bile from rising out of it. Emotions struggled for dominance. Uncertainty, fear, nervousness, disbelief, anger, blinding, deafening rage. He had to confirm. He knelt down, pressed his fingers to the word Sora had written. If they hadn't been written too long ago, he would still be able to catch a hint of emotion. He felt tight nerves and a trembling heart, a dry mouth sort of uncertainty and desperation. It felt like Sora. The sigil was right, too. There was really no denying it. Sora had found these, and Sora had thought they were important. Edo couldn't even feel angry to know that Sora had been snooping after Edo had told him not to. He lifted his eyes to the door, towards the inner temple. Please, you have to have a look for yourself. Edo swallowed through a dry throat, feeling dizzy. I have to confirm, he realized, desperation gnawing at his chest. I have to see if this is real.